If you were to stroll through ancient Athens sometime in the 5th century BCE, you might have encountered a young man with broad shoulders, a noble brow, and the kind of presence that makes people instinctively stand a little straighter. This young man wasn't yet a philosopher. He was a wrestler, and his name, at least the one history gave him, was Plato. Now, Plato wasn't his birth name. That was Aristocles, a sturdy, aristocratic Athenian name, if ever there was one. But like many young men who spent a bit too much time in the gymnasium, Aristocles picked up a nickname. Platon likely referred to the breadth of his frame, his broad chest, or maybe his broad forehead, depending on the source. Either way, Plato stuck. It's not quite biceps McThinky, but close enough. Plato was born into privilege. His family claimed descent from kings, and not the modern sort who wave from balconies. His uncle was connected to the infamous 30 tyrants, Sparta-backed rulers who briefly turned Athens into a political horror show. So Plato grew up with access to wealth, education, politics, poetry, and the very best arguments money could hear. But something tugged at him. Something more than just the glow of victory on the wrestling sand or the sharp-tongued debates of his household. That something, of course, was Socrates. Socrates was already infamous by then, not for writing anything down, he never did, but for roving through the streets of Athens like a philosophical gadfly, asking dangerous questions and refusing to be impressed by titles, reputations, or fine speeches. And when young Plato heard Socrates speak, really speak, it changed everything. He saw a man who didn't chase applause, didn't fear the crowd, and didn't offer easy answers. He offered something much rarer, the sense that life could be examined and lived with rigor. That wisdom wasn't knowing, but knowing what you didn't know. That encounter, that spell, broke something open in Plato. He abandoned any political ambition. He hung up his wrestling sandals. He became a follower. For years, he sat at the feet of Socrates, absorbing the method, question everything, accept nothing untested, follow the logic wherever it goes, even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. But of course, Athens, democracy and all, had its limits when it came to uncomfortable truths. In 399 BCE, when Plato was around 28, the state executed Socrates on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, or more accurately, for being a thorn in the side of those who preferred their truths neat and tidy. That moment, the hemlock, the trial, the smug certainty of the accusers, burned itself into Plato's soul. The city he loved had killed the man he revered, and Plato never forgot. What followed was a period of wandering. He traveled to Egypt, to southern Italy, to the court of Dionysius in Syracuse, a blustering tyrant who Plato would later try, quite foolishly, to convert into a philosopher king. It went about as well as you'd expect. Plato was sold into slavery. Yes, really, bought eventually by a friend who ransomed him back to freedom. So the young man with noble blood, the bright forehead, and the love of reason had now been a student, a runaway, and a slave. And yet through it all, he carried a vision that the world could be understood, not just endured. That ideas weren't just air, but architecture, that somewhere behind this messy, fading, flickering world was something stable, eternal, and real. When he finally returned to Athens, he founded a school in a grove named after the hero Academus, and from that leafy spot just outside the city walls, Plato began his real work, not just remembering Socrates, but remaking philosophy from the ground up, not by preaching, not by thundering from marble steps, but by writing dialogues, conversations, thought experiments that ask readers to sit down, pour the wine, and wrestle, not with bodies, but with truth itself. And so the wrestler became a philosopher, not because he gave up the fight, but because he found a better arena. By the time Plato sat down to write his famous dialogues, Athens had been through the philosophical equivalent of a nervous breakdown. Socrates had been executed. The democracy was limping along with one sandal. And people were starting to wonder whether truth was even a thing anymore, or just something politicians invented to win arguments. Plato, brooding in his grove at the academy, had a radical proposal. What if this world, all its pleasures, colors, sounds, and silks, wasn't the real world at all? What if the things we touch and see are only pale, fleeting imitations of something truer, higher, and permanent? Welcome, dear wanderer, to the theory of forms. Here's the idea. Take a chair. Any chair. A throne, a stool, a beanbag, shaped like a frog. They're all different, but something in your mind lets you instantly recognize, ah yes, a chair. Plato argued that's because they all participate in the form of chairness. Not a literal chair floating in the clouds, mind you, but an abstract, perfect, unchanging idea of what a chair is. This form is more real, said Plato, than the worn-out leg on your kitchen stool. Everything in our world, horses, courage, triangles, beauty, only resembles its perfect form. What we experience here is like the flickering shadow of a puppet show, cast on the wall of a cave. And yes, we'll get to the cave. But for now, this idea that reality isn't found in things, but in the essence behind them. It was utterly revolutionary, and not a little maddening. Imagine trying to explain that a perfect circle is more real than any circle drawn in the sand, or that the justice of a fair law court is still only an echo of capital J justice. People squinted, philosophers muttered, but Plato pressed on. And he didn't just blurt this out in lecture form. Oh no, Plato had style. He wrapped his wildest ideas in dialogues, dramatic little debates where Socrates does most of the talking and where the reader, you, is expected to think, not just listen. Take The Republic, for instance. Ostensibly a book about what makes a just city, it becomes an architectural blueprint of Plato's mind. In it, he draws up a three-part society: gold souls at the top, the philosophers; silver, the warriors; and bronze, everyone else. Justice, he says, is when each part does its job in harmony, neither interfering nor freeloading. But beneath that political scheme is something more intimate. The soul itself, Plato insists, has the same tripartite structure: reason, spirit, and appetite. You are a miniature republic, a city walking around with thoughts. And so, governing a city well and living well are not different projects. They are the same project, magnified. The point is to let reason rule, not in the cold robotic sense, but in the deeply humane sense, that we ought to let the best part of ourselves steer the chariot. This is Plato at his most ambitious. He isn't just asking, what is justice? He's asking, what kind of creatures are we, and what would it take for us to flourish? And of course, because this is Plato, he doesn't hand you answers like a waiter with a tray. He sets the stage, walks the characters on, and lets the drama unfold. Socrates asks impossible questions. His companions struggle. Ideas are born, tested, shattered. You find yourself caught in the fray, arguing silently in your mind. It's philosophy as performance, not just to teach you, but to provoke you, to make you wrestle with what you thought you already understood. And underneath it all, always, is that quiet, disquieting whisper. Maybe this isn't the real world. Maybe the truth is somewhere else. And maybe, just maybe, we can reach it if we learn how to think. Somewhere in Plato's great work The Republic, tucked among the talk of just cities and philosopher kings, comes a tale so strange, so eerily familiar, it feels more like myth than philosophy. And yet it may be the most powerful metaphor ever smuggled into Western thought. It begins, as most of Plato's parables do, with Socrates telling a story. Imagine, he says, a group of people born and raised inside a cave. Not just in the cave, mind you, but deep inside, chained at the ankles and neck, facing a wall. They've been there since childhood. They can't move. They can't turn around. All they can see is the stone surface in front of them. Behind them, there's a fire. And between the fire and the prisoners is a kind of walkway where people pass, carrying objects, statues, animals, tools. Their shadows flicker across the wall. The prisoners, never having seen anything else, mistake these shadows for reality. The shadows are the world, the sounds echoing through the cave. That's the truth. It's an uncomfortable image, and it's supposed to be. Now imagine, Socrates continues, that one prisoner is freed. He turns around, painfully. He sees the fire and the figures behind him. At first, he's blinded, confused. He insists the shadows were more real, but gradually, with time and resistance, he comes to see that what he once thought was everything was just a projection. Then he's dragged, yes, dragged out of the cave altogether, up and out into the blinding light of the sun. At first, he's dazzled, overwhelmed, but slowly he begins to see. First shadows again, then reflections in water, then the things themselves, trees, stars, animals, the sky. And finally, at the peak of this vision, the sun. This, says Plato, is the journey of the soul, the ascent from ignorance to knowledge, from illusion to truth. But the story isn't finished. Now imagine the freed prisoner goes back into the cave to tell the others. His eyes, having adjusted to the sun, now struggle in the dark. He stumbles. He mumbles. The others laugh at him. "You've gone blind," they say. "The shadows are clearer than ever." And if he persists, trying to unchain them, trying to drag them toward the light, well, they'd probably kill him. It's not a subtle parable. For Plato, the cave is the world of appearances, the everyday, the comfortable, the second-hand truths we inherit. The light is the world of the forms, of knowledge, of philosophy. And the journey, it's hard, it's painful, and most people would rather not bother. Plato wasn't naive. He knew most people aren't racing to question the very basis of their reality. Comfort is a seductive jailer. The fire's glow is warm. The shadows are familiar. Why disturb it? But for those who do, for those who are dragged or drag themselves into that light, there waits a kind of freedom that can't be undone. Once you've seen the sun, you can't unsee it. This isn't just about metaphysics, it's about education too. The Greek word paideia didn't just mean teaching facts, it meant forming the soul, turning it toward the good. That's what the cave story really is, a guide to transformation. Not filling a pail, but lighting a fire. And for Plato, this ascent, this turning of the soul toward truth, wasn't some academic luxury. It was the highest calling. Not everyone could do it. But those who could, those who'd made the climb, had a duty to govern, to teach, to return to the cave, even if it meant ridicule or danger. Because knowledge, for Plato, wasn't something you hoard. It was something that binds you to others. The light you find isn't just for you, it must be shared, even if they cover their ears, even if they throw stones, even if they insist the shadows are enough. If there's one idea in Plato's work that consistently makes eyebrows shoot skyward, both in admiration and alarm, it's this: until philosophers become kings, or kings become philosophers, cities will have no rest from their troubles. It's a statement so bold, so unapologetically elite-sounding, that even many of Plato's fans squirm a little. But let's not leap to conclusions yet. First, what did Plato mean by philosopher? He certainly didn't mean a bearded recluse scribbling riddles in a basement, nor an endlessly abstract hair-splitter, nor even, ironically, someone like Diogenes barking in the marketplace. Plato's philosopher is something else entirely, someone who has undergone that long, slow ascent from illusion to truth. Someone trained not only in logic and mathematics, but in justice, self-mastery, and the art of turning the soul toward the good. Plato wanted leaders who didn't want to lead. That's the paradox. He believed the best rulers would be precisely those who didn't lust for power, who had no desire to dominate, who saw ruling not as a prize, but as a burden. People who'd rather contemplate the eternal, but who return, dutifully, reluctantly, to the cave because they know someone must guide the city. Compare that to the typical political careerist, eager, charming, hungry for influence. For Plato, that's exactly the problem. The worst kind of people are often the ones most eager to rule. So instead, he imagines a radical reformation of education. In the Republic, he lays out a multi-decade curriculum for the guardians of the state, starting from physical training, then arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and dialectic. Only after long years of study, testing, and moral development would the best of the best emerge, and only then would they be allowed to govern. A philosopher king, then, is not someone with a beard and a theory. It's someone who sees beyond appearances, who knows the form of the good, and who can apply it with wisdom and restraint. The philosopher rules because they know the cost of ignorance. But Plato knew how outrageous this sounded to his fellow Athenians. Rule by nerds? Rule by people who prefer thought to action? People who might question the gods, who don't flatter the crowd, who would rather argue about justice than win a vote. It felt deeply un-Athenian. And yet, hadn't the so-called normal leaders sentenced Socrates to death? Hadn't the average citizen been swayed by speeches and gossip and fear? Maybe something different was needed. Plato saw politics not as a game of power, but as a branch of ethics. Governance was an extension of the soul. Just as the just person is ruled by reason rather than appetite, so too the just city should be ruled by wisdom, not desire or brute strength. Of course, history has a way of mangling such visions. Over the centuries, the philosopher king has been misunderstood, misused, and occasionally claimed by the sort of rulers who would have made Plato shudder. Despots with delusions of wisdom, bureaucrats who confuse spreadsheets with truth. But at its heart, the idea remains oddly luminous, that perhaps leadership shouldn't be a reward for ambition, but a sacred duty entrusted to those who least want it, who've seen the light and come back not to rule, but to serve. Because Plato wasn't advocating for tyranny. He was dreaming of a city in which justice wasn't shouted about in the streets, but lived quietly in its very design. A city where power bows to wisdom. And though no such city has ever truly existed, the question still hovers in the air. What would the world look like if the wisest among us led? Plato, for all his architectural brilliance in building ideal cities and sketching grand theories, never lost sight of the individual, the trembling, yearning human creature caught between appetite and awe. At the very heart of his philosophy lies a persistent question. What are we? To answer that, Plato turns inward, not to biology or blood, but to the soul. And not just any soul. The soul as a tripartite being, three forces braided uneasily into one. In the Republic, Plato imagines the soul as a miniature of the city. Reason, cool, deliberate, guiding. Spirit, bold, passionate, honor-loving. Appetite, earthy, craving, restless. When these three are in harmony, when reason leads, spirit enforces, and appetite obeys, justice reigns within. But when they clash, when appetite takes the reins or spirit runs wild, we become divided, disordered, unwell. It's a stunningly modern metaphor. You don't need a toga to recognize the feeling. One part of you wants the gym, another wants cake, a third wants applause. But Plato doesn't stop there. In the Phaedrus, he gives us a new image, the soul as a charioteer driving two winged horses. One horse is noble, obedient, drawn to the heavens. The other is unruly, stubborn, lashed by desire. The charioteer, our reason, must hold the reins tight, guiding the pair toward truth, toward the divine. And where are they going? Not just around the track, but upward. Here, Plato introduces a strange, beautiful idea that the soul existed before this life, that it once soared among the forms, pure, radiant truth before being dropped, wingless, into a body. So what is learning? Not collecting new facts, like a magpie with shiny trivia, but remembering, recollection, anamnesis. When you recognize beauty, not just in a face, but in a line of poetry, a mathematical proof, a heroic act, something stirs. You are remembering what your soul once knew. That glimpse of truth awakens the wings. You ache not just with desire, but with a homesickness for the eternal. That longing, eros in the deepest sense, isn't merely romantic or carnal. It's a pull toward the good, the true, the real. In this sense, Plato is not simply a rationalist. He's a poet of the invisible, a thinker who believes the deepest truths are not cold and logical, but rich, strange, and remembered with the heart as much as the head. For Plato, philosophy isn't just an academic exercise, it's a form of therapy, of soul mending, a way to align the parts of oneself, to remember who we are and what we've glimpsed, a way, slowly, to grow our wings back. Of course, this all sounds impossibly lofty. Chariots, immortal souls, pre-existence, surely this is myth, not method. And Plato would smile and say precisely. He believed that myth, when used properly, isn't childish. It's a vessel, a way to smuggle truth into the soul through beauty. The myths aren't distractions from reason. They're partners in the dance. In the end, Plato's vision of the soul is both haunting and hopeful. We are not complete. We are fractured, pulled in opposite directions. But we are not doomed. The task, as ever, is to remember, to turn the soul toward what is higher, to steer the chariot, however unsteadily, toward the light. There are thinkers who influence, and then there are thinkers who cast shadows so long we scarcely notice we're living inside them. Plato is the second kind. Imagine, if you will, a young man walking the sun-drenched streets of Athens, watching as his beloved teacher is sentenced to death for the crime of questioning too deeply. That man, Plato, would turn his grief into a lifelong project to understand justice, beauty, the soul, the state, love, knowledge, and the very shape of reality itself. He didn't merely ask questions. He built an entire architecture of thought. And 2.5 millennia later, we're still wandering its corridors. It would be difficult to overstate his reach. Every philosopher since Plato is, in some way, responding to him, sometimes by building upon his ideas, sometimes by arguing furiously against them. But ignoring him, that's not really an option. Let's start with something deceptively simple: the dialogue. Plato wrote not treatises, but dramas of the mind, conversations, debates, moments of tension and tenderness between characters. His star was, of course, Socrates. But through Socrates, Plato invites us into the process itself. He didn't just tell us what to think, he showed people thinking. That method, dialectic, is now the foundation of logic, law, ethics, and even psychotherapy. A relentless teasing apart of assumptions, a refusal to settle for easy answers. It's the cornerstone of critical thought. But beyond style, what about content? Well, his theory of forms, that the material world is only a shadow of a higher, truer realm, was the scaffolding upon which much of medieval philosophy and Christian theology was built. Augustine, Aquinas, the whole cathedral of scholasticism, planted squarely on Platonic foundations. His political philosophy, though often seen as utopian or even authoritarian, launched an enduring conversation about justice and the nature of good leadership. Machiavelli challenged it, Rousseau reimagined it, Marx inverted it. But Plato had already asked the questions. His work on love, particularly in the Symposium, shaped the entire Western notion of Platonic love, the idea that love could be a ladder, lifting the soul toward the divine. It's an idea still found in literature, art, and the quiet ache of unspoken longing. Even science, oddly enough, owes him a debt. His insistence on order, number, and the intelligibility of nature inspired Kepler, Galileo, and Newton to imagine a universe governed not by chaos, but by harmony and law. Of course, Plato was not perfect. He distrusted democracy, preferred the abstract to the empirical, and occasionally flirted with ideas that, through the warped glass of history, would later be twisted into dogma. But it is one thing to note his flaws, and another to ignore his vision. Because at the core of it all is a simple, staggering belief that the world is knowable, that the soul can rise, that truth, however difficult, however dazzling, is worth seeking. In an age of noise and speed and flickering screens, Plato still whispers, "Slow down, ask better questions, turn toward the light." And so, the cave still casts its shadows, the chariot still veers, the dialogues continue, and somewhere, perhaps in a classroom, or a quiet walk, or a sudden question asked in earnest, the Platonic spark flickers again. Not bad for a man with no books, no throne, and no army. Just ideas, and a very, very long echo.